When we adopted our first rescue dog in 2012, I didn't know what a rescue dog was. This is what I thought a rescue dog was. Um, I resisted getting a dog for 20 years. It was a constant tug of war between my wife and me. She finally won. I said, okay. We went to a couple of breeders, and someone she ran into had adopted a rescue dog, and she came back and said she was going to start going that route. And so I was totally ignorant on this subject until we adopted our own dog. So this is what rescue dogs really look like. They don't look like St. Bernards in the Alps. I spent a lot of time in Louisiana and Texas researching this book, and I saw a lot of scenes like this. And no matter how well run a shelter is, how clean it is, how professional the staff is, there's something very dispiriting about seeing dogs in cages like this. But these are where a lot of dogs who come north come from. They come from shelters like this in Texas. This picture was taken in the shelter in Louisiana where our first dog came from, and I just think this picture sort of captures my image of what his life was probably like for a few months. This is Albie. This is the dog that we adopted that was really responsible for this book. And this was the picture that caused us to fall in love with him. You know, Pet Finder is sort of the Match.com of the pet world. And you go through, you look at pictures. There was a short video of him. And who can explain what speaks about any particular dog? But this picture and the short video made us fall in love with Albie. He was lucky. He survived about 4 months in a shelter where 90% of the dogs are euthanized, and I'll come to the statistics in a moment. But I had no concept of how he got here or where he came from. And the man who's at the center of this book, Greg Maley, who's in this picture, twice a month leaves his home in Ohio, drives to the Gulf Coast and up to New England. He drives over 8,000 miles every month, bringing rescue dogs north in a big tractor trailer. And my wife was following him on Facebook because he documents every trip on Facebook. And she came running in one morning and said, look, it's Albie. And we had already fallen in love with Albie, and he was just days away. And he posted this picture from somewhere near the Mason-Dixon line. This was Albie a few days after he joined our family. And, you know, it was looking into those eyes that led me to write this book. I wanted to know more about him in particular. But then I also had bigger questions. You know, why were there so many like him? Why were there so many dogs coming from the South? As I started taking him on walks, I realized that 9 out of the 10 people I ran into with dogs had dogs from Tennessee or Alabama or Mississippi. So that's the face that really launched me on this sort of expedition. You know, people say write what you know. I think you write what you're curious about, what you want to find out. It took him a while to get comfortable. He made his leap of faith up onto the bed after a couple of weeks of sleeping under the coffee table. So the shelter where Albie survived for 4 months, the statistics are pretty grim. You know, maybe 1 out of 10 dogs that comes into this shelter ever leaves. Okay, and people say, well, why is there such a problem in the South? And is it really such a problem? There are shelter dogs, rescue dogs in everyone's backyard, no matter where you live in the country. But the problem is far more acute in the South. And just to give you some perspective, so in New Jersey in 2013, this is a state with 9 million people. They euthanized 4,500 dogs in the entire state of New Jersey. Where Albie came from, the shelter serves 2 tiny parishes, which are counties in Louisiana, with 1/58th the population, but they euthanized over 3,000 dogs. So think about that. With 58 times the population, New Jersey only euthanized 1,500 more dogs than these 2 little parishes. So you can see, if it was per population, New Jersey would have had to euthanize 180,000 dogs to match the rate they were being euthanized down there. So now that I had this face attached to Albie's journey, this is Greg at home with his rescue dogs. I figured he was a good entry point into this story, that he would, in a sense, lead me to the other people who extended their hands and their hearts to help a dog like Albie and many others get from these high kill shelters up north or to safety. And I was actually able to meet the woman who was responsible for saving Albie and made sure he stayed alive for 4 months. I wasn't able to answer a lot of questions about him other than he was found as a stray. I found out the date and so forth. But I sure would, if I could ask him one question, it would be, did you have people? Did you live in a house? And how did you survive all these years? Or how long did you survive on your own? So Greg, as I said, lives in Zanesville, Ohio. This is the truck that he drives twice a month. He spends half his life on the road. He can accommodate about 80 dogs in there. It's air conditioned and heated, although you don't need to run the heat with 70 dogs in it, even in 0-degree temperatures, because the dogs generate enough heat on their own. The work, by the way, isn't just the 2 weeks on the road. On the off weeks, Greg spends about 50 to 60 hours on rescue road trips, and every trip begins with this task, which I helped with, you can see me there, where every kennel is removed, disinfected, the entire truck is cleaned, and everything put back together. It's about 20 man or women hours worth of work just to get the truck ready for each trip. Greg's pretty clever. His wife, you can see how he has his wife, Adela, under this heavy air conditioning unit. They do a lot of hard work. It's the two of them and Adela's mother who kind of keep the whole operation running. And here they're replacing an air conditioning unit on the top of just a couple of weeks ago. So I'm just going to introduce you briefly to some of the people who were central in the book. Carrie Toth is the woman who actually was Albie's adoption coordinator in Louisiana. Most people who adopt a dog will never know, maybe they might know the names of these people, they'll never see them, they'll never meet them. Greg will tell you he has the easiest and happiest job in rescue. A lot of the hard work happens in places where people never see it. Carrie is responsible for adopting about 700 dogs a year. She's a real dynamo. As you can see, she's about 4'9". She's nonstop. And where do the dogs come from? Well, they come from shelters like the one that Albie came from, but sometimes they come from places like this. They're literally discarded in dumpsters, or they hang around dumpsters because there's food to be scavenged. And so about once a week, Carrie goes out to these dump sites in these rural parishes near where she lives and often finds dogs that she then rescues and nurses back to health and gets ready for adoption in the Northeast. This is something I think is fairly typical. You walk through the shelters and you can't save them all. And most of the people who do this work are pretty haunted by the dogs that they have to leave behind. They also pull dogs from places like this. This isn't really a shelter even. This is about as rudimentary a facility as it gets. There's no shelter. There's no hygiene controls, so there's no infection control. But these dogs are rounded up, these strays, and put in these fenced-in areas. And this is the dog pound in Colfax, Louisiana. Needless to say, a lot of dogs get sick in places like this. They also go to these places and patrol and try and pull dogs from these shelters as well. One of the transports I was on, called the S Puppies, they were born in rural Louisiana to a dog that belonged to a young man that I actually met, whose dad had told him to take the puppies to the pound, which he knew was a death sentence. So he reached out to someone he knew in animal rescue, and all these puppies were saved. I mean, you can see how precious they are. There was also, on this trip, the tub puppies. These were puppies that were left in a Rubbermaid tub on a veterinarian's doorstep. This is also quite common, the way that people dispose of dogs in rural Louisiana. Now, this fellow, Tom English, he took on a little different approach to rescue. He actually found a shelter near where he lives in Texas, where he's done an amazing turnaround job, where the euthanasia rate has dropped dramatically thanks to the work that he does. And he goes there once a week, he brings food, he's got a good working relationship with the people in the shelter. This is the shelter that he's done a great job turning around. It actually sits next to the prison in the county where some of the labor comes from. You'll see in a minute. But so Tom goes out, he nurses these dogs, he trims their nails, he just provides a lot of hands-on care that the shelter staff can't do. And then this is the critical moment, he says, is you've got to get a great picture. The picture is everything when it comes to getting someone to rescue a dog. So the fellow in the orange pants is actually serving time. The fellow who's taken the picture there, I was just saying, goes out every week to this shelter in rural Texas and brings vaccines and helps them take care of the dogs. And he's turned the shelter around dramatically. They now adopt out about 80% of the dogs, where they used to euthanize about 80%. So he takes these pictures and he posts them out to various rescue groups and sends many of them north with Greg, who's the central figure in the book. Another kind of rescue you see down south is what they call street rescue. So this woman, Sarah Manns, she actually goes out in her community, and what she's really trying to do is not so much to pull dogs for adoption up north, but to do everything she can to improve the lives of the dogs living in her community. This pit bull was, like many, many dogs down there, living its life on a chained to a post in the blazing hot sun. His chain can get very hot because it's metal. They were untangling his chain. She brings food. She tries to educate people literally one by one about taking better care of their dogs. And these dogs are starved for attention. You walk through these communities, primarily poorer communities, where people have either gotten dogs for protection, is one of the main reasons, but they essentially live their lives tethered like this. Now, this is actually a bit of video to give you an idea of how many dogs live in these areas. That's a case of dog food that they brought the previous week that the owners hadn't even opened. And you can see, these two, they know the people living in that trailer actually are meth addicts. You can see there's trash all over the yard. So they come out, they try and feed the dogs, they leave food. Some of these dogs can be approached, some of them can't. And the other thing, you'll see it in the next image, Tom English, the fellow you saw at the beginning, he makes these pallets, which they just deliver them. Sometimes the people aren't even there, they don't even ask permission. So when it rains, at least the dogs have a place to get up out of these. You can imagine what this lawn or yard looks like when it pours. It turns into mud. And the dogs have nowhere dry to go. So at least these pallets give them some place to go. And we'll talk a little more about this, but there's a real cultural gap, in the South and up here about the way people think about dogs, the way they relate to dogs. Many of them love dogs, but they would never think about having a dog live in the house or sleeping in the bed or in the kitchen where they're preparing food. Dickens wrote, it was the best of times, the worst of times. You'll see, this is in some ways the saddest of stories, but it also is the happiest of stories for some of these dogs at the end, which we'll get to. I was startled to learn that the consensus estimate among rescue groups and the city of Houston that there are about 1.2 million stray dogs wandering the streets of Houston, Texas, the fifth largest city in the United States. And this is a woman named Alicia McCarty. This is another street rescue, and they do actually take some dogs that are really in distress off the streets, and some of them travel north with Greg once they're adopted. But they too go out, they leave food, they try and vaccinate, they try and educate people there. But it's quite eerie, and I'll show you another video clip. You can walk down a street and see no dogs, and then turn around, and all of a sudden there are 20 dogs materialized from under cars, from under houses, from behind bushes. This will give you a little bit of an idea how hard it is to sometimes approach some of these dogs. And there are railroad tracks that run right through and these dogs just wander all over the place. And you can see he's got some skin condition. These are pretty young dogs, not socialized, they're pretty skittish. I'll just let you watch that for a second. So, that unfortunately is life for a lot of dogs in Houston. This is a boxer mix who we found living under an abandoned house. She was very pregnant. And they had already seen her, and they were trying to make sure she was okay. And they find the same dogs as they go back every week. So they tried to lure her out, and the father. They have since both found homes. These were dogs that they actually did rescue from the streets because they were in in pretty bad distress. I think only one of the puppies survived. But one of the outlets for this group, Fifth Ward is part of Houston, one of the outlets for their dogs is this woman, Kathy Wetmore, who runs a group called Houston Shaggy Dog Rescue. The commitment that these people make to this is unbelievable. Both, in her case, financial. She's a very successful real estate broker. I think she puts about $200,000 a year of her own money in getting these dogs ready for adoption. I met a lot of people who do this work who burn through bank accounts and marriages and you name it. But Kathy, like a lot of rescues, specializes in shaggy dogs for the most part. The problem is so overwhelming, it's a way for people to kind of take on their piece of it. One of the dogs that Kathy recently rehabilitated and came up north with Greg and rescue road trips just earlier this month is Noah. And this is a picture of Noah as he was found in Houston living on a trash heap, and you can see he suffered from multiple problems. I'm going to show you a couple of pictures of his rehabilitation. They're a little hard to look at first because he was in such bad shape, but it's such a miracle story, and it's so emblematic, I think, of the stories of a lot of these dogs, the stories they would tell if they could tell us. So he was brought into Houston Shaggy Dog. Kathy agreed to take him on and have him try and nurse him back to health. So this is after he was cleaned up and just covered with mange, this is skin disease. So that was the first week, and then February started to look a little better, and then in April, I don't know if you can orient yourself in the picture, he's lying on his back, very peaceful, and that sort of shows a dog that's beginning to feel a little bit secure and looking a little more content. And then this was Noah finally in June after 7 months. So $10,000 worth of veterinary care. The adoption fee was $200 for him. This is the kind of investment and sacrifice that a lot of people make to get these dogs up here. And then Noah became a bit of a celebrity because he was on the cover of Houston Pet Talk magazine. So that's quickly sort of some of the tougher side of this story, and now we'll sort of move a little bit more towards the happier part of the story. So Greg, twice a month leaves Ohio, as I said, in this big rig picking up dogs to transport them up north. And he's very clever. He uses Facebook all the time. And there's a method to his madness. He's trying to get people, he wants people to get excited about this big day in their lives when a few days after this, when he arrives in the Northeast, he wants to make it, as much of a national holiday for them as he can, because he knows it's going to be tough. Sometimes it's hard adjusting to a dog. Dogs have, take patience, and he wants everybody to remember why they adopted these dogs in the first place. So you see him here in Louisiana, taking a picture of every dog that gets on board the truck, and he will post all along the way. So as we did, you can follow your dog's journey as your dog comes north. One of the dogs that joined us in Louisiana on one of my trips actually rode in the cab with us because she has epilepsy. We had to give her medication regularly. And keep in mind, so Greg has one backup driver. It's two guys. And when I was there, I slept in the trailer on the floor with the dogs, and it's all hands on deck if you're there. But usually it's Greg and one other guy. And these dogs have to get out for walks in Louisiana and in Mississippi. You've got 80 dogs to take care of. It's not an easy job. You make way less than minimum wage when all is said and done, because you're running a very expensive truck that requires, thousands of dollars of fuel. And then and yet you take on a special needs dog like Sadie, who needed special attention, had to ride it up with us in the cab all the way from Louisiana to Connecticut. Now, there are 3 places along the way where these groups have sprung up called the Angels. Greg calls them the Angels, in Birmingham, Allentown, Pennsylvania, and in Connecticut. And when Greg comes in every other week, about 24 volunteers, usually on average, show up, they meet the truck, they get all the dogs out for a walk, they spend a couple of hours, giving them treats, make sure they have water, and just giving them some love. This is a stressful journey. They're on the truck, for 3 days or so. But once Greg leaves Louisiana on, Thursday morning, he and his other driver switch off and drive straight through to Allentown, Pennsylvania, all the way from Louisiana, with a stop in Birmingham for a visit with the Angels. And there's one shower during the week in Virginia. And it's a dirty, messy, physical job. Very stressful. They are never away from the truck for a minute. I mean, they'll take turns, going into the bathroom, the rest stop, whatever, but they are really hands-on all the way. So one of the big events in this journey every other week that Greg documents on Facebook is when they cross the Mason-Dixon line. Because that, when people don't realize the Mason-Dixon line actually, they think of it as dividing the free states and the slave states, which it did, but actually the Mason-Dixon line's history goes further back. But to Greg, it's very symbolic. The dogs have left the South, where there's this enormous problem, and they're in the North, where what they call their forever families are waiting for them. And you can see, this is taken from his Facebook page. He says, "Are you excited? You're making your sign. We're almost there." He's really, getting people excited. And this is no other dog that you saw before who was on his journey in early September. I think this was around the Mason-Dixon line. And, Greg will swear to you that the dogs know something good's about to happen. That they sense it, that they know they're on their way to something good after, very difficult lives. So the big day, when Greg starts dropping off dogs, is on Saturday mornings, every other Saturday morning, with drop-offs in New Jersey, New York, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, and it's called Gotcha Day. And Gotcha Day is an amazing experience. It's so emotional, and it's so, people are waiting for the truck in these designated stopping points. They're usually public parking lots with their signs, and there are kids, and when they see the truck, everybody just, lets the applause. And no matter what kind of day he's had, and one day I was with Greg and the truck broke down in Connecticut and we were hours behind schedule, and it was a $500 repair which wiped out his entire profit for the trip. But he never lets that spoil your Gotcha Day. When he gets out of that truck at every stop, he's going to give you a big greeting and make it as exciting as possible. So there are goodbyes to be said to every dog. I find it almost impossible to look at these slides and not sort of relive the emotion, but this is a little bit what it sounds and feels like on Gotcha Day. And now he's going to take a picture because it's going to go on Facebook, like everything else for every dog. He also does a couple of things that I think are really kind of subtle and clever. For example, if there's a child there to meet a dog, he'll usually give them, he has an envelope with the health records and everything. He'll usually hand it to the child and say, "You got to make sure you bring this with you to your first vet appointment." Because right away he's communicating right then that with this dog comes a lot of responsibility. He wants it to be happy, but he wants you to understand that he's taken on a big responsibility. And like I said, Greg will tell you that he feels that as the week goes on, the dogs sense that something good is about to happen. Now this dog, you can see the folks are holding the picture that they've brought with them of the dog that they fell in love with online. And I mean, what can you say? Does this dog think he's home or not? It's not just the 6-day journey from the south or the 4-day journey, whatever it is, from the south. Some of these dogs, we looked at one earlier, that have made it from the death's doorstep, literally, to being rehabilitated and adopted out, a journey from death's door to a safe haven. This next picture is one of my favorites because it just seems to capture the entire joy. Now, we talked about this dog Noah, who was found living on a trash heap in Houston, and the rescue organization that saved him spent $10,000 to get him well, and adopted by 2 women who live in Brooklyn. This is Noah's gotcha moment. And watch when he meets the 2 women who've adopted, and they've never seen each other before. It's a very emotional day for everybody. And then there's always the dogs that, Greg says goodbye to. He's an absolutely remarkable guy. He and his parents ran 5 family restaurants in Ohio that eventually closed one by one. And he was out of work, living at home with his mother. when he got a call from his sister one night. She's actually the founder of a great rescue organization in Connecticut called Labs for Rescue. And there was a woman transporting some labs in Ohio, and there was a bad snowstorm, and she was stuck. And Greg went out and met the car and ended up driving her to Connecticut with the dogs. And that's how he got started transporting dogs. And he's, as I said, when you do the math, and he charges like I think $150 to transport each dog, and rescue organizations go online, they make a reservation for the dogs, but it costs a fortune to run this truck, and the hours of commitment. He's gone half his life. He leaves his wife every other Monday, and he's gone for a week before he gets home again. He arrived home in Ohio 2 hours before his wedding. He doesn't take a sick day. He doesn't take a vacation day. He goes. You could drive bottled water. You could drive auto parts and make more money. But this is the life he feels called to live. Everybody follows him on Facebook. He's got something like 50,000 followers now on Facebook. And these are the words he uses at the end of every trip. You can follow him. Just go to Rescue Road Trips on Facebook, and it's well worth it. Great to see all these happy stories that have come out of very sad stories. I have one more slide to show you. So this was sent to me by a woman in Connecticut. So her dog Cyrus had ridden up with Greg 7 years ago, and she posted him with this book. But anyways, that's the story. Any questions? Anybody?
So if you wanted one of his dogs,
yeah,
what's your first step?
First thing I would think, if you're interested in adopting a rescue dog, is you want to deal with a reputable rescue. There are a lot of people driving up with puppies in cars without interstate transport certificates, without health records, and that's a disaster. Okay, you don't want to go that route. You want to ask around and ask veterinarians, ask people who've adopted dogs about their experience with these rescues. I mean, Labs for Rescue, who we adopted from, they'll do a home visit. They're checking you out while you're checking out the dogs. Kathy Wetmore from Houston Shaggy Dog Rescue, if you've ever had a dog, she's going to call your vet. She's going to ask you. She's one of the toughest people to adopt from, and she's very rigorous about it. Yeah. One of the misconceptions I had when my wife said something about adopting a rescue dog or a shelter dog, a lot of misconceptions that these will be dogs that have been traumatized and therefore have behavioral problems, or they may be more prone to illness, when in fact, generally speaking, purebred dogs are more prone to illnesses than mixed breed dogs, and they tend to have more temperamental problems. There's a great book I would recommend called Inside of a Dog by Alexandra Horowitz. She's a professor at Columbia, and she'll talk about purebred dogs that have been highly bred for some particular purpose. Maybe they're hunting dogs or whatever, and then they end up living in an apartment in New York City where they're never required, except maybe the occasional rodent, to do what they have been bred to do. And they become a little manic or crazy. So there's a lot of misconceptions about these dogs, which isn't to say there aren't going to be challenging days, but I think on the one hand, you don't want to discourage people from going this route, but on the other hand, you want people to be prepared, whether they're getting from a breeder or a rescue dog, for the commitment. It's not just that you're interested now. You got to be interested in 12 years, and and have the time and commitment to get that dog out to exercise, and it needs companionship. So it is a big commitment. You don't want to take it lightly. But once you're committed to getting a dog, I wouldn't discourage anyone from buying from a breeder, but I do think there's just such a great need. And so many dogs that are perfectly adoptable dogs that are being euthanized. Some shelters will say, well, we're euthanizing, they're just euthanizing unadoptable dogs, but that's not the case. Then the euthanasia rates are staggering. A lot of these dogs are perfectly good dogs, but it's not even necessarily the shelter people run shelters don't care. They're simply overwhelmed by the numbers. You've got to make room for the next, group of dogs that are coming in, and so one issue comes up all the time in rescues is the no-kill movement. The idea that you should never euthanize a dog. Tom English, one of the guys I talked about, he says, I support that as an aspiration, but I know here in Texas, you'd have dogs piled on top of dogs in these shelters. He said, I'm first committed to no suffering, and then to no kill. But there's not much in a place like Houston where there's over 1 million strays. There's not much really any who speaks for the dogs. I mean, they don't vote. There's no there are people who care, but they're with so many people in need, it's kind of hard often to make the case with politicians to allocate resources for this.
I just have 2 footnotes for you. I went to his website, and there is a list of agencies that he deals with.
Yeah.
But I would encourage you to talk to your local vet, because obviously you want to try to keep it local. You're not going to deal with a rescue agency in Ohio or somewhere else.
It's interesting how they structure, because, for example, Labs Rescue is based in Connecticut, but they work with other organizations, sometimes rescues down south. So there's this whole chain, and there's no one way to describe how this happens. It's kind of all over the map. But dogs that, for example, that they adopting out, or a group like Mutts for Rescue in Rhode Island, which is very good, most of their dogs are coming from the south. I mean, I thought when we saw our dog Albie, his profile, it always listed Killingworth, Connecticut, which is where the organization was based. I assumed the dog was in Connecticut, but he was in Louisiana. And then the question was, once he was adopted, then they call on a transport. But you're right, don't overlook local rescues and local shelters too. Many of them have dogs that are both local, came from local places, but many of them are bringing dogs up, taking in dogs from the south. The simple answer you hear about why so many dogs down south is there's no culture of spay and neuter. And when I walked through the 5th Ward in Houston, I don't think I saw a male dog that had been neutered. Now, I grew up in New Jersey, live in Massachusetts. I don't think in 50 years I'd seen a male dog that wasn't neutered up here. And so that's true as far as it goes, but it's more complicated than that. It's political, cultural, social, and a lot of it is a mindset that dogs are disposable pieces of property primarily, and not necessarily family members, like the way we tend to think of them. So.
Sorry, you mentioned earlier there was 1 million strays in Houston.
That's the consensus estimate by the city and the rescue organizations there. The city doesn't take issue with that number. There is some new software that somebody's trying out to estimate these stray populations I've read about. I don't think anybody could verify that number, but whatever the number is, it's a lot. And, you're 5 miles from the headquarters of ExxonMobil and, great wealth, and then you're in these very poor, it's not just, I say in the book, and I don't mean to be political about it, but these are neglected dogs living in communities of neglected people, too. I mean, these are very, the streets in Houston's 5th Ward are, I don't know if they ever pick up the trash there. It's really grim. And these dogs live outdoors. The ones that aren't tethered are free to wander. The climate is temperate, so they're outdoors all the time. And, it's an exponential problem. The population just explodes. People always want to know what the answer is. I don't think there is any simple answer to how to solve this problem. But, everyone to a person that I talked to down there said it's going to take a long time to educate people, because, people cling to tradition, I think, everywhere, but in the South in particular, Southerners told me this, this is the way I grew up living with a dog, so this is the way my kids will grow up living with dogs. So it just kind of keeps repeating itself. So the folks who do this, some of their veterinarians or their vet techs, they're just trying almost, one person at a time to educate them, or get programs in school where you bring in dogs and you read to the dog, and just hope to make some connection so that, the next generation starts to think about dogs a little bit differently than their parents did. So.
We can't all take dogs home. We can't all take all the dogs home we want to take home. But there are a lot of things people can do that are very practical. Like you can sign up to be part of a transport group. And you can sign up to foster. Because all of these rescues don't have buildings, they have us. And if we take one dog, there's room to pull one more. So,
Yeah.
as you said in your book, we're all part of this. There's something every one of us can do.
Yeah, it is like that. People, I would spend time with down south. It's like, well, if we move this dog along the path, then we can take another one in. It's almost like one little drip at a time is what they're doing. And they say, well, we're not changing the world. And Greg always would say to me on the road, we're not changing the world, but for this dog, and this family, the world has changed.